because my father decided not to come. He was still reading his newspaper when my mother and I arrived home. There was no attempt to celebrate. My parents died within 6 months of each other when I was in my early 20s. I left Melbourne after a failed early marriage. I always had a sense of history about my early years in Melbourne, and after spending 40 years away, I decided to return to my roots. I have a lovely daughter, 2 wonderful grandchildren, 2 perfect great-grandchildren who gave me and give me a great deal of nuckus, and also old friends to reconnect with. Although the Jewish community I knew had moved on and restructured elsewhere, the essence of Yiddishkeit it gave me has never left me.
Occupations for these migrants at all times, in the Depression, during and after the war, were many and varied, in shops and factories, working for a boss, and often starting up small businesses. Some families were on sustenance, a low government pension for those out of work. For the lucky ones, there was a classic path from market stalls or hawking in rural districts to opening schmutter factories. The children of these hard workers remember the colour of their lives.
Our parents' drapery store was at 161 Elgin Street, and Mum also had stalls in the markets. When we were babies, we slept in boxes at the stall or in the shop on a shelf behind the stock. That is how everybody did it. It was a good time for these emigres who had come to escape the pogroms and hardships of their native lands. Hard work had got them nowhere in Poland or Russia, but here in Australia, it really was the Goldene Medina, where it was possible to build a good life for themselves and their children.
My parents opened their first baker's shop in Swanston Street, near the Carlton Brewery. Their life was tough. Dad only slept a few hours, but he did provide rye, black and Vienna breads, onion and Kaiser rolls, matzahs and lokshen to the Australian diet, when usually only white or wholemeal bread was available. I'll never forget the wonderful smell of freshly baked bread coming out of the oven and biting into a warm, soft bread roll.
Our father bought a grocery shop opposite our home, which came with a horse called Charlie and a cart for deliveries. Charlie was replaced by a panel van in 1937. Our specialties were smoked herring and cream cheese. Our grandfather from Bialystok built a smokehouse to soak and smoke the big schmaltz herrings that came from Belgium.
Carlton means different things to different people. For some, Carlton means Yiddish, the Bund and the Kadima, even the communist Gezer, whose numbers were not large but nevertheless had a following. To other people, it means a traditional religious Carlton.
My father was a prominent congregant at one of 5 Carlton synagogues, the Shtibel. The entrance to the Shtibel was an inconspicuous dead-end lane near the intersection of Rathdown and Richardson Streets. Many of the congregants had experienced persecution, repression, pogroms, rampant anti-Semitism, and finally the Holocaust itself. But they felt proud of their origins. This quiet hideaway, a large room at the back of a small Carlton house where people could meet, talk, and pray, reminded them of the synagogues they had left behind in their villages of Europe. The unusual nature of this venue was matched by the diversity and eccentricity of its congregants. Predominantly survivors, most traced their origins to particular Hasidic movements that influenced their expression of religious rituals and the format of the service. The synagogue never had a rabbi, so frequent arguments and disagreements about the rituals arose, leading to the odd visit to the rabbinical court. The regular congregants would cast aspersions on those who attended only on special occasions. They questioned their religious beliefs, accused them of running their businesses on the Sabbath, and believed that their hypocrisy would ultimately lead to damnation. Donations, of course, were always gratefully received, regardless of the source. On one particular Sabbath, a congregant rolled up his sleeve to demonstrate 10 watches, each purported to keep him up to date with a specific time somewhere around the world. I was encouraged to make an offer on one of the watches. As a 10-year-old, I could be convinced that the synagogue was privileged enough to host a prominent international star in its midst. My subsequent discovery that he had served time for receiving stolen goods did not diminish my faith in humanity, nor did it diminish his eligibility to be a 10th in a minyan. Finding a minyan was challenging after all, especially for early morning services. As the synagogue did not have a regular cantor, the task of conducting the service was usually shared amongst the congregants, particularly those who felt they possessed unrecognized operatic talents. There were often fierce competition for the pulpit. My late father was often a prominent starter in the race to the pulpit. He regularly conducted services during the high holidays and spent hours rehearsing some of the finer points of various tunes, which he recalled from his life in eastern Poland. Heimlichkeit, warmth, spontaneity, and humour drew congregants to this small synagogue despite apparent irreverence.
I went occasionally to the Big Shul in Palmerston Street, just around the corner from Stone Shul. What a fine man was Rabbi Gurevich, and what a fine-looking man he was. He had a beautiful beard and a gorgeous speaking and singing voice, and was always impeccably attired. He was highly respected, even by the non-Jews.
Others will tell stories about the Polish and Russian Jews who dominated Carlton, but I would like to suggest that the Palestinians, especially those from Tzvat, made significant contributions to the culture of this little community. In May 1928, the Australian Jewish Herald reported that of the 2,000 Jewish immigrants who had reached Melbourne during the previous 18 months, over 40% had come from Palestine. The Kadima did not attract these Hebrew speakers. Instead, they formed a separate organisation with programs that would provide the essentials of modern Hebrew culture and language for themselves and their children. This was the Ivriya, the Eretz Israel Society, which established its own Hebrew school that in 1939 became the Bialik School. Whether from Poland, Russia or Palestine, we were all bound by culture and mostly the Yiddish language, but there were differences. I recall a heated argument breaking out between a Polish lady and a tzvasa, each insisting that her pronunciation of the Yiddish word for garlic was absolutely correct. One pronounced the word knobel, and the other pronounced it knobel. Each insisted, and neither was prepared to concede. Fortunately, it didn't actually lead to a bloigus, but the group of friends who were present couldn't stop laughing for some time at the heat this argument generated.
Political leanings in Carlton ran the full spectrum from hard left to hard right, even though one of our writers said that nearly everybody was left-wing then, a linker. Of course, wherever your parents' affiliations lay, that was what you saw, and the youth groups you joined generally reflected their ideologies. The political and ideological discussions in each other's homes would go on for hours over cups of tea and Shtetl cake. Epic, passionate, often heated, and seldom finished or resolved, there were endless arguments about the rights and wrongs of socialism, communism, Bundism, Zionism, and religion, and how only one of those ideologies could save the Jewish people and the world.
Many of the left-wing Jews were post-war migrants who had fled to Russia during the German invasion of Poland. They survived there, whereas those left behind in Poland perished. They felt indebted to the Soviet Union. My father was one of those faceless men who went out after dark to stick Communist Party posters illegally on walls and lampposts. The deed was done at night, and he took me with him to hold the paste container and brush. I was about 12 at the time. I hated being on the wrong side of the law. My husband caused my father's disillusionment with communism, able to tell him firsthand about the terrible suffering of the Russian people, perpetrated not only by the Nazis, but also by their own government. My father was aware of the various trials against subversives and enemies of the people, but kept believing that the end justifies the means. What he now had to acknowledge was the inequality and fear the average person, especially the Jews, lived under in the USSR. It must have been hard for him to give up his dreams of a better system that would bring a fairer world to all. He was such an idealist.
Communist Party members gained a strong influence in several Jewish institutions, including the Kadima. They used these organisations as platforms for propaganda for the Soviet Union. The Kadima youth organisation was controlled and used in this way. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, however, the Bund and the revisionist Zionists combined to confront the so-called progressives. There were some very stormy general meetings at the Kadima, and eventually the progressives were ousted.
In my early teens, I attended Habanim meetings in Herzl Hall in Drummond Street. But in 1946, aged 18, I joined the Kadima Youth Organisation, the KYO, where I felt very much at home. The KYO was a vibrant cultural and social organisation. Its membership consisted of a mixture of left-wingers and many who were not at all political. We had speakers on Jewish and wider issues, literary readings and group discussions in Yiddish. We held dances, picnics and camping excursions and gathered to listen to music.
The religious Zionist movement, B'nai Akiva, started up at Haskalah Talmud Torah when I was about 10. Habonim may have been ideologically closer to where my parents stood, but I fitted in better with the B'nai kids. They seemed more sedate, which suited my quiet temperament. This is where I spent most of my teenage years.
For my social life, I joined the Young Mizrahi, which was the only organisation in Carlton where flum boys and girls could meet. The most popular event at Monash Hall was the Sunday night dance, where many young people met their future partners. When the newcomers from Europe started arriving around 1946, my generation of young people did not really understand what they had been through. At first, they spoke no English and tended to stick together. They congregated at the Kadima, waiting for month-old Yiddish newspapers and journals from Europe. At first, there was a bit of snobbishness by those who had grown up in Australia. We actually called them refos. Fortunately, this attitude didn't last long. I'm sure that the dances helped to break some of the barriers.
You could say that our home was a hotbed of anti-communism. My father said that he was the victim of Jewish communist purge in Carlton. During the 1930s, he was the secretary of the Gazette, an active Yiddish-speaking social democratic organisation operating in Carlton. During the political debates that they regularly held, he described the newly found Jewish autonomous region in eastern Russia, Azerbaijan, as a deception on the Jewish people. He questioned why the Soviet Communist Party had chosen such a forlorn area on the Chinese border to house the Jewish independent state. He was asked to withdraw his opinions, but he refused. Subsequently, at a convened meeting of members, a trial was held, and he was expelled from the organisation.
Yiddish in the Kadima was not, as is sometimes portrayed, the sole province of Bundists. From 1947 onwards, the great majority of Yiddish-speaking Jews in Carlton, and therefore the majority of the Kadima's audiences, were Zionists.
Our cheder was the Talmud Torah Haskola, or Tamo, as we affectionately Australianised it. That day, at the end of 1947, by the time I arrived at Tamo, I knew that partition in Palestine and that Australia had voted in favour. Other Carlton Jews had also heard, and a small crowd had quickly gathered. It was a glorious morning, early Melbourne summer, already warm by 10 a.m. Mazel tov Yidden.
Mazel tov.
Mazel tov Yidden was the repeated greeting. Bottles of whiskey and brandy, usually packed away after Kiddush on Shabbos, suddenly appeared with biscuits and lekker. And otherwise, very sober Jews were shouting L'chaim and drinking spirits long before lunchtime. Some spoke English, but the majority were savouring the moment in Yiddish. The affirmative vote for partition was so momentous an event, so stunning, that the Carlton Jews who had gathered at the Haskola, by now about 50 of them, felt they had to do more than wish each other Mazel Tov and drink L'chaim. So spontaneously, religious and not so religious, traditional and secular, they decided to proclaim a Yontef. All of us Cheder students were called to participate. The Torah scrolls were taken out, and the men danced as if it was Simchas Torah.
As it is all over the world, education in Yiddish Carlton was the stepping stone into a brighter future. As it is written, when does a Jewish fetus become viable? When it graduates from medical school. But because these were Jews, education was viewed much more broadly than that. As well as being a pathway to advance their children's futures, it was desperately important to these parents to cultivate and preserve a knowledge of their proud heritage. They were going to succeed in the world, certainly, but as Jews steeped in Jewish learning. The slant of that learning varied according to which tradition they adhered to. The time devoted to it was often astonishing. These were busy kids, helping their parents out at the markets or in the shops, fulfilling parental dreams at Princess Hill or University High, and after school in Tamo or Peretz, learning musical instruments and following youthful ideals in youth groups of every ideological colour.
Like many boys my age, I trod the footpath from Princes Hill Primary School and then Princes Hill High to Tamo 4 days a week between 4 and 6 p.m. and Sunday mornings from 10 till 12. I attended for around 10 years, interrupted only by 1 year at that Bundesden of iniquity, the Peretz Yiddish school, to teach me to write a letter in Yiddish to my father's relatives in Israel or America. Each day of the week, with the exception of Friday, a range of teachers for whom working at Tamo was their third job of the day gave 2 hours of biblical lessons. Water pistol fights, cherry pips placed under teachers' chairs producing flatulent-like sounds, and various burglaries at the local milk bar all served to relieve boredom and prevent teacher somnolence. Corporal punishment was frequent and met with occasional protests from concerned parents. Rabbi Rudsky and later Rabbi Kalinski presided over our education.
What does it mean, sir, when he took a woman unto himself? Or he lay with her? This caused Reverend Rudsky to cough and splutter and say, you'll find out when you grow up.
My parents were far from happy with my education at Ascoli. At the Carlton Shul, my father befriended Reb Levitan, an elderly man who had, like Rabbi Gurevich, studied at one of the great yeshivas in Lithuania. Reb Levitan would teach me privately. Reb Levitan soon realised that he would not get very far teaching me religion. He introduced me to Yiddish literature and poetry. I became acquainted with Sholem Aleichem, Peretz, Bialik, and many others. Despite the Reb's 80 years, he would walk each evening the many blocks from Elgin Street in the winter. Because darkness became early and the street lights were few, he would carry a lantern with a candle in it to light his way. I would start our lesson eagerly and soon became fluent in reading and writing Yiddish. It was an unspoken agreement that if either of my parents entered, the poetry or storybook would be replaced with the Chumash. These lessons sadly came to an end. Reb Levitan, due to his great age, became frail and could visit no more. To this day, I remember his gnarled hands pointing out paragraphs for me to read, and his warmth and his gentleness.
My brother Sol wanted to play football, so asked my mother for footy boots. She said to him, "Don't you tell your father that you are playing football." Azad goyish azad. Jews don't do that. Our piano teacher was Miriam Rothwood. Everybody in the community knew her as the pianist who could play Chopin as well as she played folk songs. There were many musical events, and it was nearly always Miriam who accompanied other musicians and singers. Of the songs we sang at Yiddish school, I remember Rezele, the tenderest love song I've ever heard in any language.
Stiebel wohnt mein Teier Esele. Jeden Abend fahren Hazel, dreh sich herum. Gib a Pfeif und ruf euch Hazel. Komm, komm, komm. Öffnen sich a Fenster auf, wachst auf harte Heisele. Und bald klingt in stillen Gessel, als is kosret Reisele.
Noch a Weile wart, mein Liebe, bald will ich sein frei. Geh sich noch a paar Mal lieber, 1, 2, 3.
Gib mir a Freilacher, soll sing und knack mir nis a Lach. Herr, ich auf die Trepplach läufen ihre drobne Fieselach. Scheuner Rock von letzten Treppel, nimm sie lieber Gib a dir a Kusch in Keppel, kum, kum, kum.
Ich will dich betten, doch wie du, sollst da häuf nicht pfeifen mehr. Herr, der Pfeif schon, sagt die Mama, sie ist uns Vater, ich sie sehe. Pfeifen, sagt sie, ist nicht Jiddisch, passt noch bloß mal sehen. Gib a Zeichen, Post auf Jiddisch, 1, 2, 3.
Quell von heim nicht pfeifen mehr, drauf gib ihr a Schwuelle. Während dir zu lecher will, wären froh mein Snuelle. Quell sein, wenn du willst, noch so wie dein Mann fromm. Jeden Schabes gehen in Kleisel, komm, komm, komm.
Ich lebe es dir, mein Liebika, und erfahr dir so wie du. Strick ich a Schenk für den Säckel, mit am Morgen da wie du. Wenn gefällt ins Bett in Kleisel, sorgen sollst du sehen. Es hat gestrickt, mein lieber Reisel, 1, 2, 3.
Dank für dein Matronele, lieb dir a so ein Reisele. Lieb dein Mammen, lieb das Gessel, lieb das alte Heisele. Lieb die Städtlach leben Heisel, tress euch sehr herum. Herr, dein Mame ruf schon.
Reisel!
Gib mir a Freilacher, sing und knack mir Rieselach. Herr, läuft die Trepplach, springen ihre drobne Fieselach. Wieder steht vertracht das Heisel, Skessel wieder stumm. Komm zu mir in Chalem Reisel, komm, komm, komm. I loved Princess Hill and appreciated the attention we immigrant kids received from the teachers. Many migrant students from Princess Hill High in the 60s became prominent in medicine, dentistry, architecture, business, politics, and education.
Of course, there were less successful stories, and these were often the girls. In their backgrounds, some had amazing survival journeys, such as living wild in the forest with no chance at education. And then expectations or prejudices in Melbourne thwarted them even further.
At University High School, towards the end of fourth form, all the students received guidance in choosing our senior subjects. I wanted to do law, but the mistress advised me that although my other subjects would probably carry me through, I had not caught up sufficiently in English. I was so upset. I went to the classroom, picked up my books and left. There seemed no point in staying if I couldn't go on to tertiary studies.
the boundaries blurred between politics, religion, social life, theatre, and education.
Skiff was where the children of Bundist met every Sunday to be taught left-wing ideas and to promote Yiddish culture and language as a key to Jewish identity. We were idealistic and full of life. At summer camp, at the end of every day, at sunset, we gathered hand in hand in a circle to sing and reaffirm our commitment to each other and to our beliefs.
On many Sunday afternoons, the Kadima held various functions. There was an annual bazaar, raffles, especially the popular tombola, a big wheel that was spun